Hi there, folks. My name is Adrian, and it was on January the 6th, 2007, that a young couple named Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsom were supposed to meet friends for dinner and then a party. However, they would never actually arrive. By the next morning, their family were calling, searching, and slowly beginning to realize that something terrible must have happened, because both of them could not be reached, and they seemed to have abandoned their plans and work altogether. And soon enough, several very disturbing clues would emerge. And what started as a dual disappearance would soon turn into one of the most darkest stories that I have ever come across. Before we begin, welcome back to Coffee House Crime, folks. The channel is run by this guy and 3 other humans. If you haven't subscribed yet, we post once or twice a week here, usually true crime or dark stories, so would greatly appreciate it. And if you don't, you're gonna have to speak to this one. That's his entire week's worth of work done, by the way. All he has to do is be held and stand in front of a camera, unlike me, who actually has to research these stories, and he's still complaining about it. Anyway, folks, with all of that out the way, please grab yourself a coffee and let's get ready for the deep dive today. This is the case of Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsom. The date was January the 6th, 2007, and today we are in Knoxville, Tennessee. A couple named Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsom had ordinary plans that evening. With initial plans to go out for dinner together, they then intended to meet friends at a birthday party. But the strange thing is that, despite promising they would be there, neither of them ever showed up. Now, at first, no one worried because couples can always run late or change plans at the last minute. But Shannon and Chris were not the kind of people to just vanish and leave everyone guessing. Especially not Shannon, who was not only expected to be home that night, but also had work the next morning. What was odd is that both of their phones seemed to be turned off too. Now, earlier that day, Shannon had already visited her best friend Cara at her apartment, which can be found at the Washington Ridge complex. She parked her vehicle, notably a Toyota 4Runner, outside of the apartment, before then getting ready with Cara and then waiting for Chris, who had spent most of his day golfing, before then planning to head over to meet her. That is an important detail, by the way, because when friends went looking for them later that night, they found Chris's pickup truck still sitting outside of the apartment, but as for Shannon's 4Runner, well, that was gone. So, where was she? And was Chris with her? With Chris's pickup truck outside of the apartment, it meant that it was very likely that he had made it there. Of course, meaning that wherever they were likely together, at least to begin with. But somewhere between that apartment complex and the plans that they had for the rest of their evening, they seemed to just suddenly disappear. Naturally, by the following morning, that concern had now turned into panic for both of their families. Shannon's mother, Dina, went to check on her daughter, expecting to find her asleep in her bedroom. But after opening that bedroom door, she realized that the entire room was empty and untouched. This wasn't a case that she had got home and then decided to leave early that morning, but more like she had never actually made it back home. Trust me here, a mother can always tell. And when Dina received a text message from Shannon's work to confirm if she wasn't coming in for her shift that day, that is when she knew that something was seriously wrong. In response, she contacted Christopher's family, and it turns out that they too were wondering where Christopher had gone, meaning that all of a sudden, both families immediately knew that both of them were missing. Something was deeply wrong here. They just didn't know what. Both families contacted the police. However, with both Christopher and Shannon now qualifying as adults, it meant that they had to wait at least 24 hours before they could officially file a missing persons report. And of course, I understand why those rules exist, but when your child is missing and every fibre of your being knows that something deeply has gone wrong, this rule isn't fair. It's unkind and cruel. So, it meant, at least for now, both families were officially on their own, which is ridiculous. With this in mind, they decided to press on to try and find their children, and thankfully, they would actually have backup through friends and extended family. They began their search by checking their apartment before then moving on to police stations, hospitals, and even homeless shelters. Basically, just desperately trying to find any scrap information that may give them a lead. But the clues would not calm anyone down. If anything, it only made things worse. But before we get into what happens next, because trust me, it gets far darker, we should first take a look at who Shannon and Christopher were. Beginning with Shannon, she was 21 years old at the time and was a senior at the University of Tennessee, where she was studying sociology. She was born in Texas on April 29, 1985, before then moving with her family to Knoxville when she was only 12 years old. She lived with her loving parents, Dina and Gary Christian, and her older brother, Chase. And by all accounts, Shannon was one of those who seemed to collect friends wherever she went. She was bubbly, social, warm, and very much loved. Now, Shannon was especially close with her mother, Dina, and despite being at an age where many people are desperate to move out and get away from home, Shannon decided to choose the University of Tennessee partly because it meant that she could stay close to her family. Now, that doesn't mean that she wasn't independent, because she very much was, and worked 2 jobs alongside her studies to save money and even buy herself a brand new Toyota 4Runner, which, as we know, would later become one of the first major clues in this case. As for Christopher, he was a 23-year-old Knoxville native, being born on September 21st, 1983. Growing up, he was remembered as happy, easygoing, and hands-on. He loved baseball and had a creative side, often making little handmade gifts for his family. At high school, Chris was known to be a talented baseball player, and after graduating, he followed his practical side into carpentry, studying at Pellissippi State Technical Community College, before then going on to work for B&F Construction. So, in many ways, Shannon and Chris were both at that early adult stage where life is just starting to properly open up for them. We're talking work, study, friends, family, independence, and, in their case, a new relationship that was only a few months old. Life was exciting, and deservedly so. By January 2007, they had been together for around 3 months at the time. It was still new and exciting, and they were only beginning to fold into each other's lives. Things like sharing plans, sharing friends, and showing up together whenever one of them was invited. And I know, slightly strange pivot here, but actually, when you're covering a story about 2 young adults who have their entire lives ahead of them, including university, work, relationships, and the kind of future that they want, it does make you wonder how many people are actually watching this and thinking, what do I actually want to do with my life? Or perhaps you're not 21 anymore. Maybe you're just working full-time with plenty of bills and responsibilities in front of you. But deep down, you wonder, what would it have been like if I went into that industry instead? You know, many people don't actually know this about me, but all the way back in the year 2008, before engineering and even university, I was actually already a YouTuber. And then, of course, came uni, the degree, entering the corporate world and absolutely hating it, before finding myself right back where I started, here on YouTube. What I'm trying to say here is that many of us don't actually know what we want to do when we're younger, or perhaps we have a dream, go for something sensible, and then actually realize that life is too short. You should follow the passion that you actually have. So, if that curiosity inside of you is currently flickering, then maybe this video's sponsor, Southern New Hampshire University, is worth your time. SNHU is one of the largest accredited universities within the United States, and some of the most affordable online tuition rates in the nation. They offer over 200 online degree programs, and because there are no set class times, you can study when and where it actually works for you. One of the degrees that really stands out to me is cybersecurity, especially with how much of our lives, money, and personal information now live online. SNHU even offers an online BS in cybersecurity with a generative AI concentration, which feels very 2026 in the best way possible, and something that I would seriously consider. With SNHU, you can transfer up to 90 credits towards your bachelor's degree from previously earned college credits, military experience, and you may even be able to get credit for other professional certifications and experiences you've earned along the way. By the way, SNHU is also voted to be one of the country's most innovative universities by US News & World Report. So, whether you're trying to change direction, build confidence, or finally start working towards something you actually care about, it's never too late to begin. So, go to snhu.edu/coffeehousecrime to explore over 200 degree programs and find your path forward. Thank you to Southern New Hampshire University for sponsoring this video, and thank you to you folks for listening, because as you know, it's sponsors like this that help keep the channel going. And with that said, let's return to Shannon and Chris, because that night they were not heading somewhere strange, dangerous, or unknown. They were simply heading out to meet friends for dinner and then head to a party. Only, of course, that ordinary Saturday night never actually happened, because somewhere between Shannon waiting at Kara's apartment and the two of them arriving at that party, everything changed. Now, while both families were searching for these answers, another discovery had already been made. But at first, nobody actually connected it to Shannon or Chris. It was on Sunday, the 7th of January, that being the following morning, that a Norfolk Southern employee was carrying out routine work near a set of railroad tracks in Knoxville, and that's when they found something lying near the train line. At first glance, it was barely recognizable. Wrapped in a comforter, badly burned, and also left beside the tracks, he couldn't quite figure out what he was looking at. But then, all of a sudden, the worker realized that what he was actually staring at was human remains. The authorities were called to the scene immediately, and because of the terrible condition of the body, there was no quick way to identify who it was. However, soon enough, they heard the news of Shannon's and Christopher's disappearance, and that is when they realized that this body very well could belong to one of them. But in the meantime, and while completely unaware of the body found near the railroad tracks, the two families kept searching on their own. Now, surprisingly, they actually managed to extract location data from Shannon's cell phone via her provider, something that would very likely not happen anymore due to modern privacy laws. They realized that Shannon's phone had last pinged near a cell tower close to Cherry Street, which is around 6 miles from the apartment complex where she and Chris had vanished. So, with this information at hand, both families travelled to that location. After searching the surrounding area, they found her Toyota 4Runner parked on Cherry Street. However, it didn't look right. Not only had the number plates been removed from the car, but inside, her photographs, teddy bear and iPod had all been taken away. The floors were dirty too, which very much wasn't like Shannon. And as for the seats, well, they had been pushed back so far that Shannon almost certainly wasn't the last person to drive it. Not only that, but sitting in the center console was a pack of cigarettes, which is odd because neither Shannon or Chris smoked. It was kind of like her car had been stolen, wiped of its personal identity, and then abandoned only a few streets away from home. By now, the body found near the railroad tracks was beginning to be examined, and only once forensic officers took the comforter off of the body did they realize the true horror of what had happened. The victim appeared to be a man in his 20s, and he was naked with his hands bound behind his back. Clothing had been wrapped around his head and tied in place with shoelaces, and from what they could see, he had been bound, gagged, sexually assaulted, and badly beaten before his death. But the injuries that killed him were 3 gunshot wounds to the back, neck, and head. After that, his body had been set on fire in a feeble attempt to destroy evidence. And tragically, soon enough, the body was confirmed to belong to him. His mother and father, Mary and Hugh, were then given the news that no parent should ever have to receive. Their son had finally been found, but in the worst way possible. Not only had their son been found dead, but what had happened to him was so degrading, violent, and cruel that they were actually advised not to view his body. Just think about that for a second here, because it's genuinely heartbreaking. The condition of his body was so bad that all they could do was hug the body bag that held him. So, Chris was gone, but for Shannon's family, his discovery would not bring anywhere near as much answers as it brought terror. Because if Chris had been found like this, then what happened to Shannon? It's actually quite hard to imagine the kind of pain, anxiety, and panic that her family must have been feeling in that moment. They were probably thinking things like, was she still alive? Where is she? And was there still time? And that small possibility of finding her safe and well, no matter how slim, meant that the search for Shannon was now desperate, where every single minute counted. So, it's no surprise that Shannon's abandoned 4Runner became extremely important to officers. But by the time they were properly processing it, the victims' families had already started searching through it. Now, thankfully, they hadn't destroyed all of the evidence, because once forensic examiners went through the vehicle, they would find one very important thing. Something you could actually argue is almost comically foolish. Wedged between the seats was an envelope addressed to 2316 Chipman Street, a house that was just 2 blocks from where the vehicle was found. And, even more surprisingly, what they found on the envelope was a fingerprint. After running it through AFIS, that being the automated fingerprint identification system, they realized that it belonged to a recent offender named Lamarcus Davidson. And not only was he already known to police officers, but he had also recently been released from prison for carjacking and aggravated robbery. I mean, seriously, how stupid could you be? Now, the home on 2316 Chipman Street was a small, rundown rental house in an industrial part of Knoxville. It wasn't the kind of place that Shannon or Chris would go to. When police officers knocked on the front door, nobody answered. And with Shannon still missing, and the very real possibility that she might still be alive somewhere inside, officers made the decision to kick the door down and force their way in. Once inside, they realized that the house was filthy and chaotic. It was the kind of place that immediately told them that something was wrong. And almost straight away, they began to find clues which confirmed that they were in the right place. Soon enough, officers found Chris's driver's license and his baseball cap. Next, they found Shannon's handbag and iPod. And, alarmingly, they also found the shoes that she was wearing that night. However, there was no actual sign of Shannon yet. After reaching the kitchen, police officers noticed two very distinct smells. The first one being the smell of bleach, and the second was the unmistakable smell of decay. That is when they spotted a black trash can in the corner of the room. And when they opened it, police officers found a dirty white sheet stuffed over a pile of black garbage bags. And when those bags were cut open, the search for Shannon Christian tragically came to its end. Cold inside of that trash can were her remains, discarded in that kitchen as if she meant nothing at all. And with that, the Christian family's last scrap of hope was also gone. Shannon's body told a very heartbreaking story. She was naked from the waist down, covered in blood, and had suffered bruising and deep lacerations. Her body was also drenched in bleach, which had been poured into every part of her. Investigators believe that, much like Chris's body being burned, the bleach was used in an effort to destroy forensic evidence. But thankfully, they had failed. Semen was discovered inside multiple orifices, and fingerprints were recovered on Shannon and the trash bags. What's worse is that all of her injuries seemed to be carried out while she was still alive, and upon further testing, they realized that not one, but at least 5 people had actually interacted with Shannon before her discovery, which meant that multiple people would have had the chance to save either her or Chris before their deaths. The news was devastating, revolting, heartbreaking, and infuriating all at the same time, and unfortunately, this is the kind of story that stays with you forever. But for Shannon's family, it was 1,000 times worse. In fact, local police were so shocked and overwhelmed by this case that many would actually need therapy afterwards. They were left heartbroken and absolutely furious. And with Shannon and Chris now both found, this investigation would become a full-scale manhunt for the monsters who did this. So, with that said, police had a name to begin with, and that, of course, was Lamarcus Davidson. However, they also knew that this was not the work of just one person, and so they started digging. And very quickly, another name appeared. Eric Boyd. Now, not only was Eric already known to law enforcement, but records showed that multiple calls were made between him and Lamarcus on the night that Eric and Shannon went missing. With this in mind, an internal police bulletin was released, and later that day, they thankfully managed to track and stop him on the road for questioning. Funnily enough, at first, Eric would claim that he didn't even know Lamarcus, which was quite bold considering his phone records would say otherwise. But once officers told him that they knew this was false, and they made it clear why they were asking, Eric's story immediately changed. Suddenly, he didn't want to, quote, go down for somebody else's crime. Eric told the officers that Lamarcus might be hiding inside an empty house on the edge of town, a property that the two of them had allegedly robbed around the time that Shannon and Chris were taken. And so, with this information at hand, officers decided to travel down to this empty house. Once they arrived, they realized that this home had a for sale sign outside, which of course would make it the perfect spot for a wanted fugitive. However, when police forced their way inside, they didn't find it empty or even clean. They found rubbish, food packaging, and takeout bags, and sitting among the mess was Lamarcus. Lamarcus was filthy, disheveled, and obviously arrested on the spot. But before he was placed in handcuffs, there was one thing about him that really stood out, that despite him being a filthy mess, his shoes were crispy clean. A pair of Nike shoes that, as it turns out, did not even belong to him, but to Christopher instead. So, police now had Lamarcus in custody, and as you might expect, to begin with, he basically denied everything. But when police officers told him that they had already found his fingerprint at the crime scene, Well, he decided to change his story not once or twice, but a total of 5 times. So eventually, Lamarcus would try to claim that 2 other men had arrived at the house that night with 2 strangers tied up in the back of their car. 2 strangers that he had never seen before. And according to him, because apparently he didn't want to have anything to do with this, he then decided to leave the house, not to call the police, but to smoke weed instead. Because apparently that's what innocent people do when you come across a hostage or two. By the time he came back, he claimed that Shannon was already tied up in the living room and that she apparently told him that she didn't want to die. But Chris, he was already gone. And that is when he apparently left again, took Shannon's vehicle, wiped it down, and then abandoned it. And so, in his version of the story, he was basically being framed and, essentially, was the unluckiest man in Knoxville. But officers were clearly not buying it. And, as often happens in stories like this, thugs eventually turn on one another. That is when Lamarcus eventually started blaming his half-brother, Latalvis Cobbins. And before long, he also added George Thomas to the list. So, by January the 11th, 4 people had been arrested. But during the interviews, there was one other name that kept surfacing. And that was an 18-year-old woman named Vanessa Coleman. As it turns out, Vanessa would be the 5th and final piece to this puzzle. And so, with all 5 suspects now identified, investigators could finally begin piecing together what they believed happened inside that house on Chipman Street. But piecing things together would actually prove to be difficult, because none of these people could actually be trusted, and with all of their stories changing and conflicting, it was hard to make sense of what was the truth and what were lies. When investigators compared the 5 different stories to the evidence available, they found that Latalvis gave the most plausible account. He claimed that, alongside Lamarcus and Eric, the 3 of them had gone to Washington Ridge Apartments to meet another girl. But when they saw Shannon's shiny 4Runner and a young couple standing outside together, their motivations all suddenly changed. According to Latalvis, he and Lamarcus had jumped the pair at gunpoint. They then surrounded Shannon and Chris, bound their hands behind their backs, and then forced them into the vehicle, before then driving them to the house on Chipman Street. And this is where their stories seemed to fall apart, because while some of them tried to separate themselves from the worst of what had happened, the forensic evidence would, of course, tell a very different story. DNA found at the crime scene would link both Latalvis and Lamarcus to Shannon, and evidence showed that both Shannon and Chris were taken inside of the property that night. Chris was then taken to a bedroom, gagged, blindfolded, and had a dog chain and leash placed around his neck. He was then sexually assaulted by multiple members of the group. In the early hours of that same morning, he was then led out of the house by that leash, placed into a vehicle, and driven to the railroad tracks. He was then ordered to walk barefoot towards the tracks, and when he was roughly 20 feet away, he was shot in the back and the neck. Realizing that he was still alive, his attackers then approached and shot him just above the ear, severing his brainstem in the process and therefore ending his life. After that, his head was then wrapped in clothing and tied with shoelaces. His body was wrapped in a comforter, doused in gasoline, and then set on fire. And while Christopher was being murdered, Shannon was still inside that house on Chipman Street, in the middle of her own nightmare. It turns out that during that time she wasn't alone, because Vanessa was helping to keep Shannon captive. Vanessa later claimed that she wanted nothing to do with the crime, and would even suggest that she herself had been held against her will. However, there were no signs on her body to support that, and actually, there was one other piece of evidence to contradict her entire statement, and that was Vanessa's very own diary. On January the 9th, which would be later that day, she wrote, "Last night was one of a kind. We stayed with a crackhead that is as cool as hell. I've had one hell of an adventure since being in the Big TN. It's a crazy world these days, but I love the fun and adventures and lessons that I've learned. It's going to be a long, interesting year." I have to say, those don't sound like the words of someone who believed she was a hostage. And yeah, you were right, Vanessa. A long, interesting year was definitely ahead for you. Detectives believe that Shannon was tortured for 2 entire days, where she was repeatedly beaten, tied to a chair, and sexually assaulted by not only the men, but Vanessa too. The assault was so prolonged and violent that, by the end of it, she was covered in bruises, cuts, and lacerations. I can't actually share all of the details here, because they are too graphic for YouTube guidelines. But towards the end, bleach was actually poured inside of her, before her body was then doused in it. A bag was then placed over her head. She was stuffed inside a garbage bag, and then placed inside the bin. And to make things even worse, all of this happened while Shannon was still alive and conscious. until eventually she passed away inside that bin. I have to say, those details push the boundaries of this case beyond anything that I've ever covered before. What these 5 monsters did to Shannon and Christopher was cruel, degrading, and utterly inhumane. And all of this was done towards 2 people who had never even wronged any of them. And I think that's why this case still makes people so furious. Because Shannon and Chris weren't merely killed, they were humiliated, tortured, and literally treated like garbage. No surprise, but Lamarcus, Levoltis, and George were all hit with a mountain of charges, including rape, robbery, kidnapping, aggravated kidnapping, and premeditated murder. Meanwhile, Vanessa faced dozens of charges that were connected to Shannon, including kidnapping, robbery, theft, rape-related charges, and murder. And Eric Boyd, who prosecutors believed had played a much larger role than he initially admitted, was first charged federally as an accessory to a carjacking and for helping conceal a felony. But eventually, he too would face state charges for murder, rape, robbery, and kidnapping. The first person to stand trial was Eric, though at this point it wouldn't be for murder, but instead for his federal charges. In April of 2008, he was taken to a federal court and found guilty of being an accessory to a fatal carjacking and failing to report the location of a known fugitive. He was therefore sentenced to a total of 18 years in prison. Eric's biggest day in court would come much later, but for now, let's focus on the others who had to face their own trials. In August of 2009, Latalvis stood trial and was found guilty of first-degree murder of Shannon Christian and facilitating the murder of Christopher Newsom. Despite the possibility of the death penalty, he instead was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Lamarcus was next, who prosecutors believed was the actual ringleader and the one tied to the carjacking, the house on Chipman Street, and the most horrific parts of what happened inside it. To say that his trial was brutal is an understatement. The judge called his crimes one of the most outrageous, cruel, and inhumane cases that he has ever seen. And honestly, it's quite hard to argue with that. As a result, Lamarcus was found guilty and was even sentenced to death, with an additional several years stacked on top. The next one to stand trial was George Thomas, who faced many of the same charges. And although he avoided the death penalty, he was sentenced to life without parole. And finally was Vanessa's turn. Her case was unfortunately more complicated, because prosecutors had to prove exactly what she did in this case. Not just what she saw or what she knew, but what she was actually responsible for. In the end, she was acquitted of first-degree murder, but instead was convicted on lesser charges connected to Shannon's kidnapping, assault, and death. And so, as a result, she was sentenced to 53 years. So, with that first wave of trials now finally over and all 5 convicted in some form, there was at least some kind of accountability. However, unfortunately, that justice would not actually last very long. It was in the year 2011 that the judge overseeing most of these trials, that being Richard Baumgartner, would actually resign from his role after being found buying drugs from several convicts. In addition to this, there were also allegations of sexual misconduct and abuse of power. 2 things which are absolutely unbelievable from a judge. He actually died several years ago, by the way, which is kind of unrelated, but I thought I'd share it. Anyway, with the judge possibly being impaired during these trials, it meant that all of them would now have to face a retrial, of course bringing the nightmare back to the victims' families all over again. Thankfully, Lamarcus and Latalvis were denied any sort of new trial. However, both George and Vanessa were granted retrials. Although George was tried again, he was once again found guilty, but this time his sentence was changed from life without parole to the possibility of parole only after 51 years. Vanessa's retrial was again more complicated, but in February of 2013, she was resentenced to 35 years in prison, with time already served counted towards that sentence. That means that between her first and second trial, she got 18 years less than originally received. Personally, I think that's bloody ridiculous. Let's not forget Eric, by the way, because although he had faced his federal charges, he had not yet faced any trial for murder. By 2019, he was back in court and, in the end, was found guilty on nearly all of his charges. This included murder, kidnapping, robbery, and rape connected to both Shannon and Chris. He was therefore sentenced to 2 life sentences, plus another 90 years on top of that. A big change from the 18-year sentence that he had previously received a few years prior. Imagine that, by the way. An entire decade behind bars and more than halfway through your original sentence just to be told that it's now life times two. And finally, in the year 2019, and after more than 12 years, the legal side of this story was about as closed as it was ever going to be. I think this has to be one of the most horrifying stories that I've ever covered, with one of the sloppiest legal endings to boot. And I genuinely feel both horrified and traumatized for Chris and Shannon, and I hope that both of their families are finding peace. As for the perpetrators, well, basically all of them are gone for good, minus Vanessa. She actually may be eligible for parole as early as 2036, which means she could be out in as little as 10 years from this video, which I think is unfair because, to be honest with you, she deserves to be in there for life. Anyway, folks, thank you so much for watching today. I really do appreciate you being here. And as always, I'll see you again next week for another video. Before you go though, what are your thoughts on this case? Because there are so many strange and sloppy parts to it. Do you think that the perpetrators received the sentences they deserved? And what do you think about Baumgartner? As always, whatever your opinions are, please share them in the comments down below. And thanks again to Southern New Hampshire University for sponsoring this video. Go to snhu.edu/coffeehousecrime to explore over 200 degree programs and find your path forward. Just a reminder that if you found this case interesting, please do consider subscribing as it does help the channel out. Anyway, with that said folks, thank you again for watching and I'll see you again next week for another video. Until that moment arrives though, remember to look after yourselves and, of course, each other. Thank you and goodbye.